She would remember the choosing week for the rest of her life, not for the princesses in their silk, not for the feasts or the music or the speeches about alliance and legacy. She would remember it for the way her own boots sounded on the stone floor of the great hall, too loud, too heavy, too wrong, while every other woman in the room moved like water. She would remember the smell of pine resin still on her hands from the border. She would remember thinking, over and over, like a prayer she could not stop repeating, that she did not belong here. And she would remember the exact moment Thorfin Highmore turned away from a princess mid-sentence and looked at her instead. But that came later. The trouble started 3 days before, when Sienna Gravenor rode through the eastern gate of the highland citadel with a scouting report in her saddlebag and pine needles in her hair. She had been on the border for 4 months, 4 months of sleeping under open sky, of tracking territorial markers along the northern ridge, of eating dried meat and hard bread and drinking from cold streams that tasted like stone. 4 months of silence and wind and the deep, private satisfaction of doing the one thing she was genuinely good at. She knew the Highmore territory better than anyone alive. Every deer trail, every creek crossing, every hollow where the snow drifted deep in winter and the wolves denned when the storms came. She had mapped it with her feet, her nose, her hands in the dirt, and she had done it alone because that was how she preferred it. Alone meant no one looked at her and found her lacking. Alone meant no one measured her against some standard she could never meet. Alone meant she could be competent and quiet and invisible, and those 3 things together felt like safety. She had not expected to come back to the citadel this week. Her rotation had another month left, but the message had reached her at the northern outpost 2 days ago, carried by a young runner who was out of breath and wide-eyed. All pack members recalled to the citadel for the choosing week. The Alpha King was selecting a mate. Every pack member was expected to attend. Sienna had read the message twice, folded it, tucked it into her saddlebag, and ridden south feeling something between dread and irritation. She did not like the citadel. It was too large, too crowded, too full of people who spoke in layers and meant things she could not read. She had grown up in the lower ranks of the Highmore pack, the daughter of a tanner and a seamstress, and she had learned early that the grand stone halls of the Highland fortress were not designed for people like her. She could navigate a forest in the dark by scent alone. She could not navigate a dinner table without knocking something over. The eastern gate was open when she arrived. Servants moved in organized streams across the main courtyard, carrying linens and platters and arrangements of mountain wildflowers. Banners she did not recognize hung from the upper walls, deep purple and pale gold and forest green, and she counted at least 4 unfamiliar crests before she dismounted. The princesses had already arrived. She led her horse to the stables, handed the reins to a groom, and stood for a moment in the shadow of the stable wall, watching the courtyard from a distance. She could see them through the open doors of the great hall. Women in gowns that caught the light, their hair arranged in elaborate twists and braids, their laughter bright and practiced and confident. Each one had arrived with a retinue, advisors, handmaidens, guards in polished armor. Each one represented a powerful allied pack, and each one was here because their families believed they were worthy of a king. Sienna looked down at her own clothing, dark brown leather tunic, scuffed at the elbows, cream wool shirt with a small tear at the left cuff that she kept meaning to mend, dark green trousers with mud dried along the hem, boots that had walked 500 miles since their last proper cleaning. She pulled her dark grey cloak tighter, checked that the bronze pin at the shoulder was still holding, and slipped through the servants' entrance. She was not here to be seen. She was here because the recall was mandatory. She would stay at the back of every gathering, turn in her scouting report, and ride back to the border the moment the choosing was done. That was the plan. The first feast was that evening, The great hall of the highland citadel had been transformed. The long trestle tables were draped in white linen, and candles burned in every iron sconce along the walls. The high table sat on a raised stone platform at the far end, and the 5 visiting princesses were seated there in a shimmering row. Sienna counted them from her place at the lowest table near the kitchen corridor, where the scouts and border guards had been seated. Princess Aurielle of the Valmaran pack sat at the centre of the high table, directly to the right of the king's empty chair. She was tall and striking, with dark hair coiled in an elaborate crown of braids and dark eyes that moved across the room like she was cataloguing every face. Her gown was deep burgundy, fitted and high-collared, with gold thread woven through the bodice. She sat with the posture of someone who had already won. Beside her, Princess Lillian of the Thornhaven pack was smaller, softer, with auburn hair pinned loosely and a rose-coloured silk gown that made her look like she had stepped out of a garden at sunset. Gold earrings caught the candlelight when she turned her head. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile Sienna recognized from her own face, the one that covered nerves. The other 3 princesses sat in a row beside them, a willowy woman with red hair and a pale green gown from the Ashkirk pack, a broad-shouldered woman with dark skin and a gold-trimmed black dress from the Dunvale pack, a quiet young woman with honey-brown hair and a cream gown from the Solwick pack. Each of them beautiful, each of them poised, each of them exactly what a king was supposed to choose. Sienna ate her bread and broth and watched. The princesses spoke to each other in the careful, musical way of women who had been trained to make conversation into an art form. Aurielle dominated the table without raising her voice. She asked questions that were really statements and offered compliments that were really assessments, and every word she spoke drew the attention of the room toward her, like light bending toward a prism. She was, Sienna realized with a sinking feeling, extraordinary. The kind of woman who could command an army and a banquet hall with equal ease. The kind of woman who looked like she had been sculpted specifically to sit beside a king. Lillian, by contrast, was watching the hall the way Sienna watched a forest. Quietly, absorbing. She caught Sienna looking at her once and tilted her head slightly, a small, curious gesture, before someone spoke to her, and she turned away. The other 3 princesses had settled into their roles with practiced ease. The Ashkirk princess discussed timber trade with her advisor in a low, confident murmur. The Dunvale princess studied the hall's stone arches with the appraising eye of someone who had grown up in grand places and was comparing this one to better ones. The Solwick princess ate very little and folded her hands between courses, her nervousness visible only in the way she kept straightening the already straight neckline of her cream gown. Every one of them belonged here. Every one of them had been raised for a moment exactly like this. Sienna looked down at her broth. A thin film had formed across the surface. She pushed the bowl away and folded her arms and reminded herself that she had not come here to compare. She had come because the recall was mandatory. She would watch, she would wait, and she would leave. The hall went quiet when Thorfin Highmore entered. She had seen him before, of course. He was her alpha, her king, the man whose territory she had spent 4 years patrolling. She had seen him at distance during pack assemblies. She had seen him riding the high trails above the citadel when she returned from long rotations. She had once delivered a border report directly to his war room and stood 6 feet from him while he read it, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain every wolf in the room could hear it. She had never told anyone about that. The hammering. The way her body tilted toward him without her deciding to, like a tree leaning toward sunlight, like something deep in her bones recognized something deep in his. She had written it off as instinct, deference, the natural response of a lower-ranked wolf to her alpha. She had told herself that for 4 years, and she had almost believed it. He entered the hall wearing a deep blue velvet tunic with bronze clasps at the throat, the collar high, the fabric catching the candlelight in a way that made the blue look almost black. A bronze crown sat in his light blonde curls, and his blue eyes swept the room with the calm, measured attention of a man who noticed everything and reacted to very little. Every princess straightened. Auriel's chin lifted, Lillian's hands folded in her lap. The hall held its breath, and Thorfin's gaze swept past the high table, past the princesses, past the banners and the candles and the white linen, and settled for exactly one heartbeat on the lowest table near the kitchen corridor. On Sienna. She felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. A pull, not painful, but undeniable. Her body leaned forward on the bench before she caught herself and straightened, wrapping her fingers around the edge of the table. He looked away. He sat in his chair. He spoke to Auriel. The feast continued, but Sienna's heart did not stop hammering for the rest of the night. The second day of the choosing week began with a ride. The king was expected to accompany the princesses through the highland trails above the citadel, a tradition that allowed him to observe each woman in a less formal setting. Handlers brought out the finest horses. The princesses mounted in their riding habits, each one cut and tailored and beautiful. Auriel rode a black mare with an arched neck and handled the animal like she had been born in a saddle. Lillian rode a gentle bay and looked faintly nervous but determined. Sienna was not part of the riding party. She was in the lower courtyard, checking her saddlebags for her scouting report, which she had not yet delivered to the steward. She planned to leave it in the war room and disappear back to her quarters. She heard the hooves on stone and looked up. The riding party was assembling at the main gate. 12 riders, 5 princesses, 4 guards, 2 advisors, and the king. Thorfin sat atop a large grey stallion, his black fur-trimmed cloak thrown over one shoulder, the bronze crown absent, replaced by nothing. His light blonde curls were unruly in the highland wind, and he was listening to something Auriel was saying with the patient, focused expression of a man who took every conversation seriously. Auriel rode beside him as though the position were already hers. Her dark hair gleamed in the morning light, and she gestured toward the northern ridge as she spoke, outlining something about Valmarin's own highland passes. She was intelligent and engaged, and she spoke to him like an equal, and Sienna thought, with a clarity that felt like a blade between her ribs, that is what a queen looks like. That is the woman he should choose, strong and fearless and beautiful and certain. Behind them, Lillian was adjusting her reins with careful hands, her bay horse shifting beneath her. The Ashkirk princess sat her mount with easy grace. The Dunvale princess rode a tall chestnut and held the reins one-handed, relaxed as though she were crossing her own front yard. Even the nervous Solwick princess had managed a dignified posture, her honey-brown hair catching the wind. Sienna watched from behind her horse. She did not intend to be seen, but his stallion shifted. He turned his head to settle the animal, and his gaze crossed the courtyard and found her. Again. She felt the pull, sharper this time. Her feet shifted on the cobblestones, moving her half a step forward before she stopped herself. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to Auriel, and the riding party moved through the gate. Sienna stood in the courtyard with her scouting report in her hand and her pulse in her ears, and she thought, very clearly, stop it. He is choosing a mate. He is choosing someone beautiful and royal and important. You are a border scout with mud on your boots. Whatever you think is happening is not happening. She delivered the report to the war room. She returned to the narrow room she had been assigned in the eastern wing, far from the guest suites where the princesses stayed. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands against her knees and told her body to stop leaning toward a man who was not leaning toward her. Her body did not listen. That evening, The princesses dined with the king in the private solar. Sienna was not invited, obviously. She ate in the secondary hall with the other scouts and guards, listening to their talk about the choosing. The consensus was that Auriel would win. She was the most powerful, the most poised, the most politically advantageous. The Valmaran alliance would secure the entire western border. "What about the Thornhaven princess?" someone asked. "Too soft," another scout said. "A king needs steel beside him." Sienna said nothing. She finished her food, left the hall, and walked the outer corridor that ran along the cliff edge of the citadel. The highland wind was cold and clean, and the stars were enormous above the plateau, and she stood at the stone railing and breathed and tried to feel like herself again. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Not the dinner, not the solar, not the princesses. Here, in the outer corridor, alone, walking toward her with his hands clasped behind his back and his cloak moving in the wind. "Gravenor," he said. She straightened so fast her spine cracked. "My king!" "You submitted a border report this morning." "Yes, my king." "I read it." He stopped walking. He was 6 feet from her, the same distance as the war room 4 years ago, and the pull was so strong she had to press her hip against the stone railing to keep from swaying forward. "Your notation on the Northern Creek crossing was detailed. The seasonal water table shifts you tracked will save my engineers weeks of survey work." She blinked. "You read the water table section." "I read every section." He tilted his head, studying her the way she studied terrain, like something important was written in the landscape of her face. "You have been patrolling the northern ridge for 4 months?" 4.5. "Alone?" "Yes." "You prefer that?" It was not a question. She answered it anyway. "I am better alone." Something shifted in his expression. Not disagreement. Something closer to recognition, as though she had said something he understood in a language they both spoke. The wind moved between them and carried his scent to her, cedar and highland air, and something deeper, something warm and grounding that she had no name for, but that her body recognized the way it recognized solid earth beneath her feet. "The pack owes you a debt for that work," he said. 4 months on the ridge in autumn. The weather alone would have turned most scouts back. The weather was not difficult. "You camped through 3 storms. I saw the weather reports." She blinked. He had cross-referenced her patrol with the weather logs. The precision of that, the attention, made something tighten in her chest. "Storms pass," she said. "The terrain does not change because of weather. It changes because of water and time and wind. Those are the things worth tracking." He looked at her for a long moment, and the wind moved between them, and Sienna felt the pull so strongly that her left foot actually slid forward an inch on the stone. "You should rest," he said. "The week is long." He walked past her. He did not touch her. He did not need to. The gravity of his passing pulled at her like a current, and she stood at the railing long after he was gone, gripping the stone with both hands. On the 3rd morning, Sienna tried to leave. She packed her saddlebag. She rolled her bedroll. She checked her map case and her water skin and the small leather pouch where she kept her charcoal pencils and her measuring cord. She did everything in the exact order she always did when breaking camp, because the routine was comfortable and certain, and it did not ask her to feel anything she was not prepared to feel. She walked to the stables. The morning air was cold and sharp, and the citadel was quiet, most of the court still asleep after the previous night's feast. The highland wind carried the scent of pine and stone, and faintly, distantly, cedar. She tightened her jaw and walked faster. She had her hand on her horse's bridle when a voice behind her said, "You are the border scout." She turned. Princess Lillian stood in the stable doorway, her rose-coloured gown entirely wrong for the hay-strewn floor, her auburn hair catching the morning light through the stable's high windows. Her green eyes were curious and warm and entirely without malice. "Yes," Sienna said. "I watched you at the feast. You sat at the back table, and you watched everyone, and you did not speak to anyone." Lillian stepped into the stable, lifting her skirt above the straw. "And the king watched you." Sienna's hand tightened on the bridle. "The king watched everyone." "No," Lillian said, gently. "He didn't." Sienna did not know what to say to that. She stood with her horse and her packed saddlebag and her escape plan crumbling around her, and she looked at this princess in her silk and gold and expected to see jealousy or accusation or contempt. She found none of those things. She found the careful, sympathetic expression of a woman who recognized another woman trying very hard to disappear. "Are you leaving?" Lillian asked. "My patrol rotation resumes soon." "Does it, though? I thought the recall covered the entire choosing week." Sienna had no answer for that either. Lillian leaned against the stable wall and folded her arms. "May I tell you something honestly? I do not want to be chosen. My father sent me because the alliance would benefit our pack, and I came because I was asked. But I have someone at home, a man I love, who loves me, who is not a king and does not need to be. If Thorfin Highmore looked at me the way he looks at you, I would feel sorry for him, because I could never look back." Sienna's chest constricted. "He does not look at me in any particular way." "Sienna." Lillian said her name like it was something fragile. Every woman in that hall saw it. Every princess noticed. Auriel has been furious since the first feast, and she has not said a word about it because she does not know how to fight an opponent who does not even know she is competing. Sienna set down the saddlebag. She pressed her back against her horse's warm flank and closed her eyes. "I am a border scout," she said. "I sleep on the ground. I track deer trails and seasonal flooding patterns. I have calluses on my hands and pine sap under my nails, and I cannot remember the last time I wore anything that was not leather or wool. I am not competing with anyone because there is no competition. The king does not choose a scout." Lillian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe this one does." Sienna did not leave. She could not explain why. She unpacked her saddlebag and returned to her narrow room and sat with her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands and tried to make herself smaller than the feeling that was growing in her chest. The gravity was getting worse. She felt it everywhere now, not just when he was in the room. She felt it when she walked past the corridor that led to his quarters. She felt it in the great hall when his scent drifted from the high table, cedar and highland wind, and something warm beneath both. She felt it in her sleep, a slow pull in her bones, like her body was trying to find his even in the dark. She tested it. She walked to the farthest corner of the citadel, the eastern watchtower that overlooked the forest's edge, and she stood there and closed her eyes and tried to feel nothing. The pull was still there, fainter, but undeniable. A thread between her sternum and some distant point in the west wing, taut and patient and absolutely certain of its direction. She opened her eyes and pressed her hand against the cold stone of the tower wall and said, out loud, to no one, "This is not real." The pull answered by deepening. She went to the training yard and ran drills until her arms ached. She ran the perimeter of the citadel twice. She climbed the northern stair and stood in the wind until her cheeks burned. Nothing worked. The gravity did not care about distance or exhaustion or denial. It cared only about direction. And the worst part, the part that frightened her more than anything she had ever tracked or hunted or faced alone on the northern ridge, was that she could feel him leaning too. She would be standing in a corridor, and his footsteps would slow as he passed. She would be crossing the courtyard, and his head would turn. She would be sitting at the back of the great hall, and his eyes would find her through a crowd of silk and candlelight, and the pull between them would tighten like a rope drawn taut, and she would think, "He feels it too." She did not know what to do with that. On the fourth day, the princesses presented their pack's formal offers. It was a tradition of the choosing. Each princess, accompanied by her senior advisor, stood before the high seat and outlined what her pack would bring to the alliance: territory, trade routes, military support, breeding lines, political influence. Each presentation was polished and precise and measured in the specific language of power. Oriel went first. Her presentation was flawless. She spoke about the Valmaran western reaches, about the trade corridor that would open if the packs merged, about the military strength of her father's guard. She spoke with the confidence of a woman who had been trained for this her entire life, and when she finished, the hall murmured with approval. The Ashkirk princess spoke about timber rights and river access. The Dunvale princess spoke about southern shipping lanes. The Solwick princess, the quiet one with the honey-brown hair, spoke about farmland and grain stores and food security, and her voice trembled only once. Lillian went last. Her presentation was shorter. She spoke about the Thornhaven forests, about the medicinal plants that grew there, about the healers her pack trained. She spoke simply, without performance, and when she finished, she smiled at Thorfin with the honest warmth of a woman who harbored no expectations and no resentment. Through all of it, Sienna stood at the back of the hall, near the door, where the border scouts had been positioned as part of the formal guard. She watched each presentation. She watched the princesses. She watched the advisors and the retinues and the careful theatre of power. She watched, and she thought, despite herself, about what each alliance would mean for the pack she had spent 4 years protecting. The Valmaran Western Corridor would open trade that the highland settlements desperately needed. The Thornhaven healers would transform the pack's medical capacity. Even the Solwick grain stores, the least glamorous offer, would ensure that no Highmore family went hungry through a bad winter. These were not abstract calculations. Sienna had walked the settlements. She had eaten at the tables of border families and seen the wear in their clothing and the thinness of their stores in late winter. She knew what an alliance meant in practical, human terms, and she knew, with a clarity that made her chest ache, that any one of these princesses would bring her pack something real and valuable. And she watched Thorfin. He listened to every word. He asked intelligent questions. He showed each princess the respect of his full attention. But between presentations, in the brief pauses while one delegation filed out and another filed in, his gaze drifted. Across the hall, past the seated advisors and the standing guards and the candle-lit columns, to the door, to her. Each time their eyes met, the pull snapped tighter. Sienna could feel it in her feet, in her chest, in the base of her spine. A gravity that was not metaphor but physics, something real and insistent and impossible to ignore. She pressed her shoulder blades against the stone wall behind her and held herself still and thought, "This is not happening. This cannot be happening. You are a scout. He is a king. The distance between those two things is not a gap, it is a canyon, and you do not have the wings to cross it." He looked away. He asked the Dunvale princess about her pack's naval capacity. He was every inch the measured, deliberate king, but his body had turned 3 degrees toward the door, and Sienna, who had spent her life reading terrain and tracks and the subtle language of the land, could read that turn as clearly as a compass heading. On the 5th night, she found him in the map room. She had not been looking for him. She had come to check her border notations on the territorial map, a large parchment stretched across a broad oak table that showed every ridge, creek, and trail of Highmore territory. She had drawn most of the northern section herself, and she wanted to verify a creek crossing she had noted in her last report. The room was supposed to be empty. It was late. The choosing feast had ended an hour ago, and the princesses had retired. The citadel was quiet, but the lamp was lit, and Thorfin was standing at the map table, bent over the northern section, tracing a line with his finger. He looked up when she entered. "Your creek crossing," he said, as though they were in the middle of a conversation they had started hours ago. "You noted that the northern fork shifts eastward in late spring." She stood in the doorway. Her instinct was to leave. Her feet moved her forward instead. "It does. The snowmelt changes the course by about 30 paces. The old crossing becomes impassable by the end of the season." "Show me." She crossed the room. She stood beside him at the map table, close enough that his scent filled her nose and the pull in her chest became a steady, insistent pressure. She leaned over the map and pointed to the fork she had drawn, her finger tracing the shift in the waterline. "Here," she said. "The bank erodes every spring. By midsummer the ford is gone entirely. I have been marking the progression for 2 years. 2 years? He was looking at the map. Then he was looking at her hand. Then he was looking at her. "You have been tracking a creek for 2 years. It matters. The northern trail depends on that crossing. If the ford fails permanently, we need an alternate route before winter. You found one. A ridge path, 3 miles longer but passable year-round. I mapped it last month." She reached across the table and unrolled a smaller parchment tucked beneath the edge of the main map. Her own work. Clean lines, careful notations, the ridge path drawn with the precision of someone who had walked every foot of it. Thorfin studied the map. She watched his eyes move across her notations, reading each one, and she saw the moment his expression changed. It was small. A slight softening around his eyes, a barely visible shift at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Something quieter than a smile. Recognition. "This is exceptional work," he said. "It is a map. It is a map that will keep my people safe. That is exceptional." She did not know what to do with praise. She never had. Every time someone told her that her work was good, her first instinct was to diminish it, to point to the tools or the terrain or the time she had available, anything to redirect the attention away from herself and towards something safer. She pulled her hand back from the parchment and clasped both hands behind her back, and she felt her body swaying toward him, and she locked her knees to stop it. He was close enough that she could see the texture of the bronze clasps at his throat. Close enough that his scent was no longer a faint trace in the air, but a solid, warm presence, cedar and highland wind, the kind of scent that made her think of home and safety and the deep quiet of the northern ridge on a clear morning. The gravity pulsed between them, not pulling her forward this time, just holding her in this room at this table beside this man, like the moment itself had weight and did not want to let go. "Why did you come to the map room tonight?" she asked. She did not mean to ask it. The question came out before she could stop it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I came because you drew these maps. I come here most nights when you are on the border, to look at your work." The room was very still. "My king!" she said, and her voice was barely a sound. "You cannot mean that." "I have never said a thing I did not mean." "You are choosing a mate this week. There are 5 princesses in your guest wing. Oriel of Valmarin has offered you the entire western corridor. Lillian of Thornhaven has offered you healers and medicinal trade. You have 5 women in this citadel who are beautiful and royal and everything a king is supposed to want, and you are standing in a map room in the middle of the night telling me that you look at my creek notations." "Yes." "Why?" He turned to face her fully. He did not move closer. He did not need to. The gravity between them closed the distance on its own, the air between them thickening until she could feel his warmth against her skin from a foot away.
Because the first time you stood in my war room 4 years ago with a scouting report in your hand and pine needles in your braid, something in me turned toward you, and it has not turned back." Sienna stopped breathing. "Every day since then," he continued, and his voice was low and steady and certain in the way that only his voice could be. "Every day I have felt you, at the edge of my territory, on my border, in my forest. I feel where you are the way I feel where north is. My body knows. It has always known." "That is," she started, and then stopped. Her throat closed around whatever word she had been about to say. Her eyes were stinging and she did not understand why. She blinked hard and looked down at the map and said very quietly, "I am a border scout." "I know what you are." "I have calluses on my hands." "I know." "I cannot dance. I do not know how to address a council. I have never worn silk in my life, and I would not know what to do with a crown. I am not what you are supposed to choose." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. He turned it over and looked at her palm, at the calluses, at the rough skin, at the small scar across her thumb where a branch had caught her last winter. He ran his finger across the callus at the base of her middle finger. Slowly, carefully, like he was reading a map. "These hands," he said, "have kept my people safe for 4 years. These hands have drawn the paths my scouts follow and the routes my supply trains take and the maps that hang in my war room. These hands have done more for this pack than any alliance on that table." She pulled her hand back, not because she wanted to, because if she did not, she was going to fall into him the way a stone falls from a height, and she did not think she could survive the landing. "Pick someone beautiful," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. "Please, pick someone who belongs in a crown and a gown and a throne room. Pick Oriel. She is strong and clever, and she would be a good queen. Pick Lillian. She is kind. Pick anyone. But do not pick me because I do not know how to be what you need, and I will not survive being wrong about this." He looked at her. The lamp flickered between them. His blue eyes held hers with the steady, unwavering calm of a man who had made his decision long before this conversation began. "Sienna," he said. Her name in his voice sounded like coordinates, like a destination, like a place he had been trying to reach for 4 years. "I already did." She did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the eastern wing and stared at the stone ceiling and felt the pull in her chest so strongly that she could point to exactly where in the citadel he was. West wing, 3rd floor, his quarters. She knew it the way she knew the angle of a hillside or the depth of a stream, instinctively, in her bones. She pressed her fists against her sternum and closed her eyes and tried to think clearly. He was a king. She was a scout. These were facts. The choosing ceremony was a political event designed to secure alliances with powerful packs. If he chose her, a tanner's daughter, a woman without title or land or family name, the allied packs would be offended. The princesses would be humiliated. Oriel's father would withdraw the Western Corridor offer. It would be a political disaster. She could not let him do it. But even as she thought this, her body turned on the mattress, orienting itself toward the west wing, toward him like a needle finding true north. The 6th day was the last day before the Declaration Feast. Tradition held that the king would spend the final day in private audiences with each princess, one last chance to assess compatibility before making his choice. The citadel buzzed with speculation. The servants whispered. The guards made wagers. Everyone assumed Oriel. Sienna avoided the main halls. She went to the outer training yard, the one on the cliff edge that the scouts used, and she ran through her practice forms with her staff. Strike, pivot,
sweep, block. The movements were clean and familiar, and the highland wind cooled the sweat on her neck, and for 30 minutes she almost felt like herself again. The pull was still there, a low hum in her chest, but the rhythm of the staff gave her something else to focus on. Her body knew these movements. It had practiced them for years. It did not need to think, it only needed to move. She finished a sequence, planted the staff, and breathed. The forest stretched below the plateau, vast and green and ancient, and from this height she could see the pale gleaming thread of the northern creek winding through the trees. Her creek, the one she had tracked for 2 years, the one that would shift again this spring and need remapping. She wanted to be there. She wanted to be in the forest with dirt on her hands and silence in her ears and no one looking at her with expectation or confusion or pity. She wanted to be invisible again. He did not come to my audience. Sienna turned. Lillian was standing at the edge of the training yard, her rose gown billowing in the wind, her arms folded, her expression caught between amusement and disbelief. What? The private audience. He sent his steward with an apology. He said he had urgent business to attend to. Lillian walked closer, stepping carefully on the uneven stone. Oriel is beside herself. He cut her audience to 10 minutes. 10 minutes, Sienna. She has been rehearsing her presentation for 3 months. Sienna lowered her staff. He cannot do that. He is the king. He can do whatever he wants. That is not what I mean. I mean he should not. The allied pack sent their daughters in good faith. If he dismisses them like this, he insults every family at this table. Lillian studied her. You are worried about the princesses. I am worried about the pack, about the alliances, about what happens when he makes a decision that cannot be undone and realizes a year from now that it was the wrong one. Lillian sat down on the low stone wall at the yard's edge. The wind moved her auburn hair across her face, and she tucked it behind her ear and looked up at Sienna with those steady green eyes. Let me ask you something, she said. When you are on the border, alone, tracking a creek that nobody else even knows is shifting, do you think about what the right answer is? Or do you just see the land and know? Sienna frowned. I see it and I know. And has your seeing ever been wrong? No. Then consider the possibility that he sees you and knows, and that he is not wrong either. Sienna stood in the wind with her staff in her hands, and the highland citadel stretching behind her, and the vast forest spreading below the plateau like a dark green ocean. And she felt the pull so strongly that her entire body ached with it. I am afraid, she said. She had never said those words aloud to anyone. Lillian did not flinch. She did not soften her expression or offer empty comfort. She looked at Sienna the way a scout looks at difficult terrain. Honestly. Of course you are, she said. You have built your entire life around being invisible, and he is asking you to be seen. The declaration feast. The great hall had been transformed again, more elaborately than the first night. Every surface gleamed. The iron chandeliers blazed with twice the usual candles, casting the stone walls in warm amber light. White linen draped the tables. Mountain wildflowers filled bronze vases along the center of each table. The high table had been expanded to seat all 5 princesses and their senior advisors, and the hall was filled to capacity with pack members, allied delegates, and visiting dignitaries. The princesses had dressed for a coronation. Oriel wore a deep burgundy gown that was different from the first night, more elaborate, with gold embroidery climbing the sleeves and a gold circlet in her dark braided hair. Her expression was composed, but her fingers were interlaced tightly on the table before her, and Sienna, who had spent her life reading the small signs that betrayed what a creature was feeling, could see the tension in her jaw. Lillian wore a fresh gown of pale gold silk, simpler than the others, her auburn hair loose over her shoulders. She looked calm. She looked like a woman who already knew this night was not about her and had made her peace with it. The Ashkirk princess wore emerald green. The Dunvale princess wore deep black with gold at the collar. The Solwick princess wore ivory, and her hands were trembling slightly against the linen tablecloth. Every one of them looked like a queen. Every one of them had spent the week demonstrating exactly why their pack, their family, their bloodline was the right choice. Sienna stood at the back. Same table, same spot, same dark leather tunic and cream wool shirt and dark green trousers. She had washed her hair and pulled it back into a clean high ponytail, and that was the extent of her preparation. She had considered, briefly, asking someone for a dress. She had dismissed the thought almost instantly. She was not a dress. She was not going to pretend to be one on the most important night of her king's reign. She looked at the princesses in their silk and gold. She looked at the candles and the flowers and the white linen. She looked at the expectation on every face in the room, the certainty that tonight a king would do what kings have always done: choose power, choose beauty, choose the alliance that would make his territory stronger. She pressed her back against the wall and folded her arms and felt the pull in her chest humming like a taut wire. The hall waited. Thorfin entered alone. No guards, no steward, no advisers flanking him. He wore his deep blue velvet tunic, the bronze clasps catching the candlelight, the bronze crown settled in his curls. He walked to the high table, and he did not sit down. The hall fell silent. "I am grateful," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the room without effort. "To every family that sent their daughter to my table this week, to Valmaren, to Thornhaven, to Ashkirk, to Dunvale, to Solwick. Your offers honour me, your daughters honour me. I have spent this week in your company, and I have found every one of you to be remarkable." He paused. Oriel sat straighter. Her dark eyes were fixed on him with fierce, controlled intensity. "The choosing tradition asks a king to select the mate who will best serve his pack," Thorfin continued. "The strongest alliance, the wisest match, the most advantageous union. I understand this, I respect this, and I must be honest with you tonight, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve performance." Something shifted in the room. Sienna felt it before she understood it. A change in the air, a collective intake of breath, the sudden awareness that something unexpected was about to happen. Thorfin turned. Not toward the princesses, not toward the high table. He turned toward the back of the hall. Every head followed his gaze, to the lowest table, to the scout in the leather tunic, to Sienna Gravenor, who was gripping the edge of the bench so hard her knuckles were white, her hazel eyes wide, her heart slamming against her ribs like something trying to break free. "No," she mouthed. She shook her head. Tiny, desperate movements. "No, do not do this. Not in front of everyone, not like this. Pick someone beautiful. Pick someone who belongs up there." He walked toward her. The hall was so silent she could hear his boots on the stone floor. Step by step, past the high table where the princesses sat in their silk and gold, their expressions shifting from expectation to confusion to something they could not yet name. Past Oriel, whose dark eyes followed him with fierce, controlled intensity, her hands pressed flat against the table. Past Lillian, who closed her eyes and breathed out slowly, a smile already forming at the corner of her mouth. Past the middle tables where the pack's senior families watched with open astonishment. Past the guards and the scouts and the serving staff who pressed themselves flat against the walls to let him through. The gravity between them was unbearable now. Sienna could feel it in every cell of her body, a pull so strong that her vision narrowed to only him, to the blue of his eyes and the bronze of his crown and the steady, unhurried certainty of his stride. He was not rushing. He was not dramatic. He was walking to her the way water flows downhill, because it was the only direction that made sense. He stopped in front of her table. He looked down at her. His expression was not grand or dramatic or performative. It was quiet. It was certain. It was the expression of a man who had found true north and was simply, finally, standing in it. "Sienna Gravenor," he said. She could not speak. She could not breathe. The pull between them was so strong that her body was trembling with the effort of not standing up, not reaching for him, not letting the gravity win. "I have a question for you," he said, "and I would like to ask it here, in front of my pack and my allies and these extraordinary women who travelled a great distance to be considered." She looked up at him. Her vision was blurring. She blinked hard and felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she did not wipe it away because her hands would not release the bench. "I did not choose you tonight," he said. "I chose you 4 years ago in my war room when you stood in front of me with a scouting report and pine needles in your hair, and something in me recognized something in you, and I have never stopped turning toward you since." A sound moved through the hall. Not words, something lower, the collective exhalation of 200 people understanding something at once. "Will you let me?" he asked. His voice dropped, not for privacy, for intimacy, for the space between two people that no crowd can fill. "Will you let me choose you?" Sienna's hands released the bench. She stood up. Her legs were shaking. Her dark grey cloak fell crooked from one shoulder, and she did not fix it. She looked up at him, at his blue eyes, at the bronze crown in his curly hair, at the man who had read her creek notations and traced her maps with his fingers and felt her presence in his territory like a compass point, and the pull between them was not a pull anymore. It was a truth. It was as real and undeniable as the ground beneath her boots, and she was done fighting it. "Yes," she whispered. He took her face in both hands. His palms were warm and steady. He looked at her for one long moment, and she saw in his expression everything she had been too afraid to name in herself. 4 years of turning, of watching, of waiting. 4 years of gravity. He kissed her. The hall erupted around them, and she heard none of it. She felt only his mouth on hers, gentle and certain and warm, and his hands cradling her face like she was something precious, and the pull in her chest finally settling into stillness, like a compass needle finding north and holding there, like a river reaching the sea. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, and he said so quietly that only she could hear, "You told me to pick someone beautiful." "I know. I did." She laughed. It was a broken, wet, helpless sound, nothing like the practiced laughter of princesses, and it was the most honest sound she had ever made. He took her hand. He turned to face the hall, and she turned with him, and 200 faces stared back at them with expressions ranging from shock to confusion to something that looked, in certain faces, like wonder. The scouts at the back table were on their feet. One of them, a young woman Sienna had trained on the eastern ridge 2 years ago, was pressing both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide and bright. Thorfin did not release her hand. He addressed the hall. "The Highmore pack will honour every alliance offered this week," he said. "Trade agreements will proceed. Border cooperation will continue. No family that sent their daughter to my table will leave without the respect they are owed. My choice tonight is not a rejection of any pack at this table. It is an acknowledgement of something that has been true for 4 years and that I have no right to deny any longer." The hall was still. Then, from the middle tables, a single pair of hands began to clap, then another, then another. The sound built slowly, like rain on stone, until it filled the hall, and Sienna stood beside her king with his hand in hers, and her leather tunic, and her high ponytail, and her mud-stained boots, and she thought, I am being seen by everyone in this room, and I am still standing. At the far end of the high table, Oriel sat very still. Her dark eyes were fixed on the couple at the back of the hall, and her expression was unreadable. Beside her, her advisor leaned close and whispered something sharp, something about insult and protocol and withdrawal. Oriel raised one hand. The advisor stopped. She looked at Thorfin Highmore kissing a border scout in a leather tunic, and she looked at the way the scout's hands had stopped shaking the moment he touched her, and she looked at the way his body curved toward the woman, like he could not help it, like proximity was a need as basic as breathing. She had seen bonds before. She knew what one looked like when it was real. She exhaled slowly. Then she reached for her wine and drank, and if her hand trembled slightly, no one was close enough to see. Lillian caught Sienna's eye from across the room. She was crying. She did not bother to hide it. She pressed both hands over her mouth and laughed into her palms, and the gold earrings caught the light, and she looked, in that moment, like the happiest person in the hall. Later that night, after the feasts had ended, and the hall had emptied, and the candles had burned to stubs in their iron holders, Sienna stood on the outer corridor overlooking the cliff, the same spot where he had found her on the first night, the same wind, the same stars. He stood beside her, not touching. Close enough that the gravity between them hummed like a plucked string. Oriel will withdraw the western corridor offer, Sienna said. Possibly. The allied pacts will question your judgment. Probably. Your council will argue that you have made a political mistake. Certainly. She looked at him, and none of that concerns you. I secured the Northern Ridge route for a decade because a scout spent 2 years tracking a creek. I sleep soundly at night because that scout walks my border and knows every trail and every hollow and every place where the snow drifts deep. He turned to face her. The starlight was in his curls, and his blue eyes were very clear. I did not choose an alliance tonight, Sienna. I chose the person who has kept my pack safe for 4 years without ever once asking to be thanked for it. My council can argue all they like. She felt the gravity between them and she let it pull her. She stepped forward until her forehead pressed against his chest, and his arms came around her, and she stood in the circle of his hold with the highland wind at her back and the stars above them and the citadel solid beneath her feet. I do not know how to be a queen, she said into his chest. You do not need to know tonight. I do not know how to wear a crown. Then do not wear one. I am going to be terrible at councils. You will be honest at councils. That is infinitely more useful. She pulled back and looked up at him. I am still going to patrol the border. His mouth curved. Not a smile, something better, something private and warm and meant only for her. I would not dream of stopping you. She stood on her toes and kissed him, and this time it was her mouth that found his, and she felt the gravity settle into something permanent, something that would hold for the rest of her life. The princesses departed over the following days. Oriel left first, her retinue moving in crisp formation through the main gate, her back straight, her expression composed. She paused at the gate and looked back at Sienna, who was standing in the courtyard with dirt on her knees from the garden she had been weeding, and something passed between them that was not hostility. It was acknowledgement, one strong woman recognizing another. Oriel nodded once. Sienna nodded back. Then the Valmarin delegation rode through the gate and down the Highland road and was gone. Lillian left last. She found Sienna in the stable yard, where Sienna was brushing her own horse, because old habits did not change just because a king had chosen you. Lillian embraced her, which was entirely improper for a princess, and held on tightly, and Sienna felt the strength in those slim arms and understood that Lillian was braver than anyone in this citadel had given her credit for. "I am going home to the man I love," Lillian whispered in her ear, "and I am going to tell him that I watched a king choose a scout in a leather tunic, and that it was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Sienna held on to her for a moment longer than she meant to. "Thank you," she said, "for staying, for seeing, for finding me in the stable that morning when I was about to run." Lillian pulled back and smiled, and her green eyes were bright with tears. "You were always easy to see, Sienna. You just did not believe it." She watched Lillian's retinue ride through the gate, the rose-gold banner of the Thornhaven pack catching the highland wind, and she stood in the courtyard until the last horse disappeared down the mountain road. Then she went back to the stable and finished brushing her horse, and she pressed her forehead against the animal's warm neck and breathed, and she felt, for the first time in her life, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The weeks after the choosing were strange and new and sometimes terrifying. Sienna sat in councils and said very little, but when she spoke about terrain and resources and the practical realities of territory management, and the councillors, who had expected her to be decorative and silent, found themselves listening. She wore her leather tunic to her first formal audience with a visiting dignitary, and Thorfin said nothing about it, and the dignitary, a grizzled alpha from the southern reaches, looked at her calloused hands and her wind-burned cheeks and said, "Finally, a queen who has actually seen the land she rules." She made mistakes. She called a visiting ambassador by the wrong title at a feast, and spent the rest of the evening convinced she had started a war. She had not. She accidentally tracked mud across the formal receiving hall on the morning of a trade delegation's arrival, and stood in the doorway watching a servant clean it, and felt her face burn so hot she thought her skin might actually catch fire. Thorfin found her there, red-faced and mortified, and he looked at the mud and looked at her and said, "Good soil. Eastern Ridge?" "Northern Fork," she said miserably. "The creek bed has shifted further than you expected." And just like that, they were talking about water tables and erosion patterns, standing in a muddy hallway, and the embarrassment dissolved into something warm and familiar, and theirs. She still patrolled the border. She went out for weeks at a time, tracking and mapping and sleeping under the stars, and when she returned, Thorfin was always in the outer corridor, waiting, his body already turned toward the eastern gate before her horse appeared on the road. The gravity between them stretched across the miles like a thread that could not break, and she would feel him turning toward her hours before she reached the citadel, a warmth in her chest that meant home in a way that stone walls and iron chandeliers never had. The gravity never faded. It deepened. It became the baseline of her life, a constant quiet awareness of where he was and how he was, and whether the distance between them was growing or shrinking. She learned to trust it. She learned to stop fighting it. She learned that being seen was not the same as being consumed, that visibility did not mean vulnerability, that a woman could be known, fully and completely, and still be herself. 1 year later, she stood in the map room. The territorial map had been updated. Her creek crossing notations had been incorporated into the official cartography, and the ridge path she had drawn was now a marked route used by supply trains and messenger runners and patrol scouts. Her handwriting was on the map that hung in the king's war room, and her name was in the margin of every revised border document, and the Northern Territory was safer because of work she had done alone, on her knees in the dirt, with pine sap under her nails. A letter from Lillian sat on the corner of the table. It had arrived that morning, warm and chatty, and full of news about Thornhaven, about the man Lillian had married in the spring, about the medicinal trade agreement that had been negotiated between their packs, despite the choosing week ending without a formal alliance. Lillian wrote the way she spoke, honestly, without performance, with small observations that made Sienna laugh out loud in the quiet room. She had signed it, as she always did, with the words, "Still easy to see." Thorfin found her there. He came in quietly, the way he always did, and stood beside her at the table and looked at the map.
"There is a new shift at the Western Fork," she said, pointing. "I tracked it last month. The bank is eroding faster than I expected. We may need a secondary bridge." He did not look at the map. He looked at her. She was wearing her leather tunic. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in its high ponytail. There was a smudge of charcoal on her jaw from the pencil she had been using to mark the new erosion line. Her hands were rough and strong, and exactly the hands of a woman who had spent her life outdoors. "Beautiful," he said. She looked up. A year ago, the word would have made her flinch. A year ago, she would have argued, deflected, pointed to someone more deserving of it. But a year of being seen had changed the shape of the word in her mind. It did not mean silk or crowns or the polished composure of a woman who had been raised for a throne. It meant the creek notations, and the ridge path, and the calluses, and the charcoal smudge, and the years of quiet, competent, invisible work that had kept an entire territory safe. It meant her. "Yes," she said, and she smiled, and she did not argue. "I know,"